Здравствуйте. My name is Anita Weiner, and I've been asked to make a short presentation today about the work of the JDC in the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union for the first 10 years of their re-entry into the Soviet Union. My late husband, Dr. Eugene Weiner, and I made Aliyah to Israel in 1969 with our two sons, who were then 13 and 11. In 1996, the JDC asked my husband, who was a sociologist and a former conservative rabbi, to come to Moscow and to work with the JDC as a representative on special projects in Moscow, or in the whole former Soviet Union, for a few years. And so we did. We were there from 1996 until 1999. And I asked if somebody is documenting the work of the JDC and the things that they are doing. And I was told no. I asked if I could do so, and I got permission, and the result is Renewal, Reconnecting Soviet Jewry to the Jewish people. The goals and the principles of the JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the Joint. The JDC is an American Jewish organization created for the relief, rehabilitation, and renewal to all Jewish communities in need in the world. It does not have a political agenda. It is supported by American Jews who are both secular and religious, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, who are from all walks of life in North America. The funds for the JDC are raised from American Jews through the United Jewish Appeal, and there have been millions and millions of dollars that have been raised to save Jewish communities in 90 countries around the world from 1914 until 2014, which is the 100th anniversary of the JDC. The JDC responds efficiently, without corruption, to all Jews in need, and turns over its programs to the local government or the local Jewish community. JDC does not take over government functions. The JDC is not a political organization. It does not support any political organization, and all of its relief, rehabilitation, and reconstruction activities are open to all Jews. The JDC's goal is to help Jews to help themselves, to become self-supporting. The JDC works in cooperation with the local Jewish organizations. The JDC believes that Jews have a right to live with rights wherever they want to read. It's a Zionist organization, but it helps communities if they want to remain where they are. The JDC works in partnership with the local Jewish community in order to stimulate local leadership and who will take over the activities and responsibility for their community. That is the JDC and its goals. The JDC in Eastern Europe, after World War I until 1938, and then again until Perestroika. The JDC began its work in the 1920s and 30s in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in Belarus, in Ukraine, it was called the ag'jwin't. And it worked to help establish Jewish communes and Jewish vocational schools. The JDC was evicted from the Soviet Union by Stalin in 1938 and was asked not to return. For the next 5 decades, the JDC gathered all the time addresses where the Jews were, never forgot the Jews of the Soviet Union, and sent packages of books, religious articles, things that they could sell like jeans so they could have money, and they sent visitors with books to over 1,000 communities where there were Jews in Eastern Europe. They spent, in the 10 years before the Perestroika, between 1978 and 1988, $100 million was spent on sending packages and visitors to the former Soviet Union, to Eastern Europe. Ralph Goldman, who was the honorary executive director of the JDC, Michael Schneider, who was the executive director of the JDC, and Heinz Eppel were invited by the Minister of Religion in the Soviet Union to come in 1988 for the first visit, to return officially. And they came. And at that time, there were already cultural associations that the Jews had experienced because of perestroika. There had been no Jewish activities for almost 70 years. And yet Jews maintained their sense of wanting to be connected to the Jewish people. And although they had been deprived of all Jewish education, they were interested in finding out. So the JDC took a huge map of the former Soviet Union, and they chose 6 professionals, and they divided the whole map into 6 areas. In Siberia and the Urals, the Baltics, Moscow in the area, Leningrad, they divided the country, and all the Asiatic republics of, they had divided all of it, Estonia, Latvia, Kazakhstan, all the countries, they divided between these 6. And okay, these are your areas. And they had the list of sending the boxes, but they didn't know who was alive, who was there, where they really were. They went to the first conference. Michael Schlenov had a conference in Moscow. He called together representatives from the 250 cultural associations, Jewish cultural associations, that had sprung up all over. And there were 750 delegates who came. And these 6 JDC representatives went to the conference, and they made contacts. They made contacts with the people from their area, which was very exciting. What was the first project? Jewish libraries. A brilliant project. The Jews of Eastern Europe were highly educated, and they loved books. For 70 years, they had never read a book on Jewish history, on Jewish traditions, and they were hungry. They were very hungry for information to find out. The JDC made a frantic search for books, for well-written and scholarly and important books on Jewish history, on Jewish tradition, on Jewish holidays, on Hebrew. In a couple of years, they had 1,500 books. And this was their beginning, these 6 representatives. If a community was interested, they could receive a whole Jewish library of these 150 books, many copies of them. They could tell how many people they had in their community on 2 conditions. They had to have a space for it. They had to have a place where people, anybody could come, not just only Orthodox people, or not just only some group, not just those who were part of one party. That would be open to the community, and they had to have a librarian who would take care of the books. Every community responded in a different way. Some used a private home that was opened certain hours each week. Some used a public library that gave a portion of the space. But the library project was extremely successful. Communities really wanted it, and by 1993, they had sent 700,000 books to the former Soviet Union. People were really hungry for this. Soviet intellectuals thought that there was nothing, they had thought after 70 years of communism, they believed that there was nothing worth knowing about Jewish history and tradition. But there's a great deal worth knowing, and they learned that there is much to know. By 1989, there were 200 Jewish cultural associations when it was still the Soviet Union. And people were frightened about it, but they still decided that they would have it. There were in Leningrad, there were 1,000 members. In Kharkov, in Ukraine, there were 500 members. Associations developed, and they were very excited. The JDC decided to hold Jewish music festivals, to hold Jewish dance festivals, to hold Jewish theater festivals. And they had festivals in Odessa, in Kharkov, in Vilna. They held these festivals in 1991, 1992, to just bring the Jewish people together, to have them come out and say that they were Jewish, and to see that there are some beautiful things about the Jewish tradition. The JDC put together a directory of Jewish music, dance, and theater groups. They compiled a directory, and they sent it to all the communities. The next one is Jewish education. There were almost no Jewish educators. All this thirst for knowledge, all this desire to learn, and there was nobody who spoke Russian who could teach the schools, who could teach teach history. People wanted to know. So the JDC was competing in some ways with the Jewish Agency, with the Orthodox, with who would start the schools. And it was decided that the Jewish Agency from Israel, they would be in charge of formal and informal education, and the Orthodox would start their own schools. So the JDC, in terms of education, had to find the gaps where there was needed. And what they found was teacher training. They didn't have teachers. Teachers had to be trained about Jewish tradition, Jewish holidays, curriculum development. What is a Jewish school? How do you develop the curriculum? When do you teach? What do you teach? Textbooks. They had to manufacture textbooks. Thousands and thousands of textbooks, because they didn't exist in Russian. They also discovered that preschool education, before the formal education, that was an area that was a gap. So the JDC sponsored nursery schools for the children and for the parents to learn about the holidays, about Jewish tradition. Then they went to the college campuses and started Hillel groups, organizations, so that they could meet with students and they could bring students information and activities about Jewish tradition. And then there was Sefer, the Moscow Center for University Teaching of Jewish Civilization, and the yearly conference of Jewish scholars, which the JDC sponsored, so that Jewish intellectuals could have a place to meet and to study and to research, and it stimulated academic research and enabled Jewish scholars to connect to one another and to create Jewish study programs in the colleges and exchange ideas. Then there were adult education courses, adult education lectures that the JDC sponsored. Thus, although the JDC did not run Jewish schools, its impact on Jewish education was enormous. Then the next field was relief and welfare activities. Relief had been JDC's mission from the time it was started in 1914. But with all the schwung, with all the activities in education and religion, they didn't think that relief would be so important. What they discovered in 1992 was the winter of 1992, that there were thousands of elderly Jews all over, in towns all over the Soviet Union, whose pension was no longer adequate for them to live. The inflation had made their pension inadequate, and so they needed packages, and the JDC started a winter relief of packages sending to these people. But if you're sending a package to a Jew who has never received a package from the JDC or an organization, you want to find out about them. So they took volunteers from the community, volunteers who were interested in being leaders in their community, and they had them bring these packages. They had young people bring them, and then they would sit with the older person and talk to them and find out about their lives. And then they would make a file. What were the services they needed? They needed home help. They needed to be taken to the doctor. And that's where they started the welfare associations. The systematic visiting of the elderly with records, shopping for them, doctor visits, clothing distribution. There were tens of thousands of elderly who received these things. And the model, which then was developed, was the chesed. The Chesed, it started in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, where a very active Jewish woman decided to create a community center for all these activities. And they wanted to have it be light and full of color, and someplace that young people would like to come to. And then they sent out packages, they invited old people to light the candles, to have the holidays there. They would bring the holidays to the people, and that brings us to the next field where the JDC worked, Jewish religious renewal. So when the JDC returned in 1989, they decided that they would be responsible for training religious functionaries. They began with cantors, so the cantors could come and pray in synagogues. They started sending religious article prayer books, talesim. They made individually tailored programs for rabbis so they could come and learn about Judaism. It takes many years to become a rabbi. They started these programs, the JDC. They started making holiday kits, so that everything in the kit, with a guidebook of how to use it for Sukkot, for Shavuot, for each of the Jewish holidays, for Rosh Hashanah, for Yom Kippur, there was a kit with a guidebook, and the celebrations were communally. They weren't in an individual home. They were for the whole community to get, and people were very enthusiastic about it. The first communal holiday was a Seder in 1991, and thousands of people came to these community seders. It was a tremendous, tremendous success, facilitating Jewish community renewal and development. The goal was to reconstitute Jewish communal life, and the early cooperation was with the cultural, the VAD, the cultural associations. The operating principles were an impartial, nonpartisan approach, avoidance of political interference in local affairs, encouragement of community cohesion, community leadership, a commitment to both Jewish and Zionist principles, and cooperation with other Jewish organizations that share global Jewish agenda, the provision of advice and guidance. And it was a classic lesson in how to develop communities before communities existed. And the JDC did a superb job on developing Jewish communal leadership. And the final one is Jewish property reclamations, the final one for the first 10 years that I'm discussing. Then afterwards, many, many things have done, but I'm discussing the first 10 years. All the thousands of synagogues and Jewish schools throughout the Soviet Union, which were the property of local Jewish communities, were confiscated in 1920s and 30s. Nothing belonged to the Jew. There was no Jewish communities after that. When the Soviet Union dissolved, communities began to petition the government for the return of their property. Each republic had its own laws and customs and policies, and the JDC assumed responsibility for helping the communities to research in the archives their properties, to identify them, and to guide them on how to petition the government. But in addition to this, for communities whose buildings were restored, help was needed to formulate the community goals. What are we going to do with these buildings? The kind of activities for the future, and thinking through how to realize their goals. Local community restoration committees were set up to define and help realize these goals. And in summary, the JDC is an American Jewish organization funded by voluntary contributions from American Jews in all American Jewish communities. The JDC staff is professional and is chosen for its efficiency and its desire to serve the Jewish people. For 100 years, the organization has been helping to save and rehabilitate Jewish communities around the world. Since 1988, the JDC has contributed a great deal to the renewal of Jewish life in the former Soviet Union. And just one quote from Michael Schneider, who was the director of the JDC during the years that I was speaking of. Our greatest asset has been the Soviet Jewry themselves. Their energy, creativity, vitality, the initiatives they took. Because what has been done is not us, the JDC, it's them, Soviet Jewry. We have given them some seeds, but it's they who have done the planting and the work. Spasiba, до свидания.